I was working on Jerome's quotations of classical authors for a graduate school thesis. Jerome is known, most Catholics know him as the translator of the Bible, but he's also known for being extraordinarily learned and having one of the greatest Latin prose styles out there, up there with Cicero and Erasmus. If you were to put three across the era, Cicero, Jerome, and Erasmus would probably be your three greatest Latin prose stylists. And he's known for this love of classical learning. So I was researching in particular how he employed classical quotations within his letters. And I was working on these consolation letters, and I'm saying, wow, these are great. It'd be pretty neat if I were to put them together in a volume together. You can find translations of St. Jerome's text, but not thematically. It takes 7 of these letters. They're written over a period of 25 or 30 years, and put them together in a single volume with introduction, and that's what Jerome's Tears came out to be.
Great. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about these letters and the nature of them. They are written to people who were good friends, right?
Yeah, with one exception. He wrote to a Theodora in Spain. He never met her nor her husband. They were going to, both the two were going to make the long trip from Spain to the Holy Land just to meet Jerome and just to purchase some of Jerome's scripture commentaries and study the scriptures with him. And the husband, Licinius, died before making the trip. So Jerome was very moved by their piety and their desire to see him. So he wrote a letter. It's the briefest letter in the volume. But I think the fact that he didn't know her and he went out of his way to write a letter makes it pretty moving that he would take the time to do that.
Yeah, yeah. And another thing worth mentioning, most, if not all of the addressees of the letters and the people being mourned in the letters are saints, right? I mean, Jerome is extolling their holiness in general. I think most of them are considered saints officially in the church as well. Is that right?
Yeah, 3 or maybe certainly 4 of them are canonized saints, as we call them today, Paula and Marcella. They're not known to most people. They'd be on the historical calendar of saints, not on the liturgical calendar of saints whom we celebrate, other than, of course, Jerome. So yeah, there's some canonized recipients and some canonized deceased about whom Jerome writes.
Right, and that makes for a very interesting kind of approach that Jerome takes in these letters, which we'll of course discuss, because he's writing to very particular sorts of people. Now, I wanted to bring up this consolation genre. You mentioned Jerome's classical learning. I've had the opportunity to read some of the consolation letters written by Seneca, and of course also Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, which is a little bit different, but still in that tradition to some extent. Could you just talk a little bit about this genre in general as it existed in classical antiquity and how Jerome kind of updates it and makes his own use of it?
Right. So the art of the literary epistle, what today we would call an essay, is what in the ancient world they called letters, just like we have in the Bible with the letters of St. Paul to the Corinthians and Ephesians and so on. These letters of consolation were a style of Greek oratory, a Greek epistolary style that goes back to at least the 4th century BC. And if you read these particular letters, Jerome is very consciously writing in that style. All these letters, in different ways and different shapes, would at least have 4 of the same features: an introduction, a eulogy for the deceased, a consolation of those who are living, and then finally a series of praises for the person who had died, including along with that person's lineage, was a classical move. Now, Jerome, writing in this style, but it's kind of amusing. Jerome was a learned guy and knew it, and he wasn't shy about asserting his own literary prowess over these traditions. And in particular, also, it's the fact that it's Christian literary tradition. He doesn't hesitate to say that the Christian way of consoling is more efficient and more moving than is the pagan form. So Jerome on a couple of occasions writes how, I don't bother here to follow the precepts of the rhetoricians, as he calls it. So in making that claim or saying that, dismissing them, he's showing that, guess what? I'm better than they are. And he does that he keeps the same pattern of those 4 parts of each letter and moves them around. But what he does, unlike his classical predecessors, is he mixes in a tremendous amount of scriptural quotations and allusions, every single paragraph just flowing off the page, Old Testament, New Testament. Sometimes they're passing quotations. Sometimes he uses an image from Scripture as an extended metaphor. but he has all the scriptures right at his fingertips, and he's able to employ it in such adroit ways. It's really fascinating to watch on just that level. Right? You could read the letters of these letters of Jerome on a consolatory level, but to see it as scripture in action, that alone is a very impressive thing. So in doing that, Jerome is establishing really a new genre, a new Christian genre of consolatory epistles.
What are some of the things that Jerome thinks we shouldn't do when we are mourning a loved one?
Great question. One of them is not to mourn too excessively. The 7 letters in the volume are arranged chronologically, and that part of the reason I ended up doing that was because some of the letters refer back to prior ones that he wrote. Jerome directly I consoled so and so earlier on, use this theme, and I consoled so and so on this theme. So I'm trying to try something else. He actually says that right in his introduction. So it was unavoidable to do that. But the first letter to Paula, with whom Jerome was friends when he lived in Rome as the advisor to Pope Damasus back in 384 to 387 or 8. And he was, I guess today we would use the term spiritual director for Paula. And Paula lost her daughter, Blasilla, in the, that's the occasion for the writing. And he's writing to her and he's chiding her, and he's not shy about telling her that you're mourning too much. What you're doing is unbecoming of a Christian woman who believes in the resurrection. I thought it was, in some sense, I thought it was a little strong. I said, maybe I should not put this as the lead-off letter. But again, because of the chronology, that was necessary. But that's one thing that a person of faith shouldn't do, Jerome says, is mourn too much, because when we do that, we become self-centered, we collapse in on ourselves. A little mourning is okay, and he gives plenty of examples of scripture, of women and men, Old Testament and New Testament, who engage in the act of mourning. But at the same time, there's a limit to our grief because Christ conquered death, and there's a number of quotations he uses. Sheol has been beaten because of the resurrection of Christ, so he's heavy into the Old Testament wisdom literature in speaking of the power of Christ over death. So one who is mourning is able to mourn, but should have limits to his mourning because Christ gives the cause for our hope.
One of my favorite quotes from these letters it might be from that letter as well. Overabundant devotion towards one's children is an offense against God, which is so bracing, and it's totally true. Christ says as much, right? But it is something that, to say to someone in mourning, granted, he knows that the people he is talking to are, spiritual people, and they're probably able to hear what he has to say. But it's still just striking, that somebody would just say that to somebody who's in mourning. And I think, reading that can probably challenge us to be, as you said, less self-indulgent in our sort of emotional display.
Yeah, Jerome doesn't hesitate. To a few of the recipients, he doesn't hesitate to dish out what we would call today tough love, and I think Marcella gets the toughest of anyone. But I think that's also indicative of the nature of the relationship that Jerome had with her. And each of the 7 letters has a brief introduction to the particular context of the letter. Who is the recipient? Who is the deceased? And what is the occasion for Jerome writing to that person? So it puts it in context. But as we mentioned before, with the exception of one, Jerome is writing to friends in every case. In some cases, they're good friends whom he's known for years and prayed with. So he's not afraid to be open with them, as we would expect a tough spiritual director to be with us on certain occasions as well.